All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be focusing on somebody that you specifically wanted to learn more about.
Oh, this is exciting.
It is. This is exciting. We had a listener write in about Andrew David Edwards.
Okay.
So we've got some articles and information here.
Yeah.
Our main source is going to be his Wikipedia entry.
Right.
But, of course, as with anything online, always take it with a grain of salt.
Of course.
And feel free to dig deeper afterwards.
Always good advice.
Yeah, so this isn't just some historical figure. This is a deep dive into the life of someone very much alive and
Very much so, yeah. Currently serving time.
Oh, okay. So who is Andrew David Edwards?
Hmm.
He is an American serial killer, born in 1958.
Okay.
But here's the thing, he wasn't just operating in one city or town or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. But that's one of the first things that jumps out at you when you look at Edwards. He was a drifter.
Yeah.
And his crimes actually span 3 states. We're talking Oregon, California,
Wow.
and Colorado.
That definitely makes you wonder how many other cases could be out there.
Absolutely. Much harder for investigators to connect the dots when you've got someone who is constantly moving.
So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's sort of lay out the timeline of his known murders. And I have to warn you, some of these details are pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
Edward's weapon of choice was, for lack of a better term, pure brutality. He was known for beating his victims to death.
Yeah, that level of violence, it really makes you consider the psychology involved.
Oh, absolutely.
What drives someone to that?
Exactly. It's not just about, what happened. It's about trying to understand the why.
Right.
So let's start with 1987.
Okay.
This is when he murdered John Schirmeister in Oregon.
Okay.
And then 2 years later, in 1990, again in Oregon, he killed Anthony Thurman.
2 years. I mean, that gap is really interesting to me. Was he inactive, or are there other victims out there that we don't know about?
Yeah.
These are the questions that investigators have to grapple with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then things took a turn in 1992.
Okay.
He killed Melvin Richards and, to make matters even worse, threw his body from a moving train near Bakersfield, California.
That detail about the train, it's chilling.
It is.
It makes you think about, the level of planning.
Yeah.
And the attempt to really distance himself from the crime.
Right. Like he was trying to make the body disappear completely.
Yeah.
And just a few months after that, he murdered Bud Griffith in Colorado. Again, brutality of the beatings, very consistent.
And it's important to note that all of Edward's victims were fellow transients.
Right.
That's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did he specifically target them because they were vulnerable, or was it more about opportunity? Or was it a little bit of both?
Right.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, so it's 1993 when things finally changed. Edwards attacked Lynn DeLong with a wrench behind a bowling alley in California. This time, though, he left DeLong for dead.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. DeLong survived the attack, and it actually led to Edwards' capture.
Oh, wow.
But it gets even wilder.
Okay, Wilder, how?
Edwards actually confessed to the attack on DeLong.
Wait a minute, hold on. He confessed.
I know, right? Why would a serial killer, someone who has gone to these lengths to avoid being caught,
Right.
suddenly decide to confess?
It doesn't make sense.
Well, it turns out that he thought he'd actually killed DeLong, and he
Right.
wanted to get it off his chest before his parents found out.
Okay.
Except
Because the long lived.
DeLong lived. That one little detail throws a whole different light on things, doesn't it?
It does.
Was the confession actually remorse? Or was it some kind of twisted attempt to, control the situation?
It's tough to say. On one hand, you have this brutal series of crimes, but then you have this confession that seems almost, I don't know, naive, like you didn't really think things through.
Yeah, so in the end, he was sentenced to life in prison and is currently in Oregon.
Okay.
His earliest possible release date is when he's 93 years old. But here's the thing that really gets to me.
Okay.
He has profiles on those websites that help prisoners find pen pals.
Oh, that's a chilling detail. It really is. It makes you think about what he's seeking,
Yeah.
what he wants to portray to the outside world.
I know, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about the complexities of human nature, doesn't it?
He does.
I mean, we've covered his crimes, his movements,
Yeah.
but the biggest question still remains.
The why.
Yeah, why? What drove Andrew David Edwards to do these things?
It's the question that always lingers, isn't it?
It
We
does.
can try and piece together, the when and the how,
Yeah.
but the why is so much harder.
So much harder to grasp.
Well, and from the information that you sent, we know that he
Well,
was an alcoholic,
yeah.
had been in and out of treatment centers from a young age.
Okay, so that could definitely be a contributing factor.
Yeah,
Right.
it definitely seems possible. I think one of the articles mentioned that these murders were committed during what they call alcohol-induced rages.
Hmm. That paints a pretty disturbing picture.
It does.
Right.
Like he was completely out of control.
Yeah, and that raises a really important point.
What's that?
While alcohol can lower inhibitions,
Right,
it doesn't create a killer.
right.
There had to be something else going on.
Yeah.
Some deeper psychological issues.
Yeah.
Maybe trauma,
Yeah.
maybe abuse in his past that we don't know about.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about the time period,
Yeah.
like the late 80s, early 90s,
Yeah,
especially for someone living a transient lifestyle.
absolutely.
It wasn't like today where there's,
Right,
more awareness of homelessness and addiction and things like that.
right. Much harsher reality back then.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And you can't separate someone from their environment, right?
No?
I mean, could those societal factors,
Right.
the lack of support,
Yeah.
the feeling of being marginalized,
Mhm.
could that have pushed him further down this dark path?
It's something to consider.
It is something to consider, absolutely.
And then there's that whole thing with the pen pal profiles.
Yeah, it's unsettling.
It's so unsettling.
It really is.
Here's a guy who has committed these horrific acts.
Right.
And he's actively seeking connection with people on the outside.
It makes you question his motives.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Is it a genuine desire for human connection?
Right.
Or is there something more manipulative going on?
Yeah.
Is this a way to exert some kind of control even from behind bars?
Right. Exactly.
It's hard to say.
And that's what I find so fascinating about these deep dives.
Yeah.
We start with just a name,
Right.
a few facts,
Right.
and then suddenly we're down this rabbit hole of, human behavior,
Totally.
criminal psychology,
Yeah.
these larger societal issues.
It's a lot to unpack.
And this is where you, as the listener, come in.
Right. Exactly.
We've laid out the facts as we know them, but it's up to you to interpret them, to form your own opinions and conclusions about Andrew David Edwards
Right.
and what his story says about the world we live in.
Exactly. What stands out to you from all this?
Yes.
What questions are you left with?
Yeah.
I mean, what would you want to ask Edwards if you had the chance?
Right.
Because these aren't just abstract cases,
No.
These are real people,
Real lives impact.
real lives impacted by this man's actions.
Yeah,
And it's a story that raises important questions about vulnerability,
absolutely.
about the systems we have in place,
Right.
about how we as a society respond to these kinds of tragedies.
Well, and we've talked a lot about the darkness in this case.
Yeah.
But there is also a glimmer of hope in DeLong's survival.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, he managed to escape Edwards,
Wow.
rebuild his life,
That's amazing.
and even became an advocate for other victims of crime.
That's a powerful reminder that even in the face of unimaginable trauma,
Yeah.
there's still the possibility of resilience. Yeah. Of finding the strength to not only survive, but to help others.
And while we can't undo the past,
Right.
we can learn from it
Absolutely.
by understanding the factors that contributed to Edwards' crimes.
Yeah.
We can work towards creating a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to happen.
Yeah. It's about addressing those root causes we talked about.
Right.
Poverty, addiction, mental health.
Yeah,
It's about providing support for those who are most vulnerable,
absolutely.
those who might be on the fringes of society.
Because ultimately, it's about building a world where everyone has a chance,
Yeah.
where everyone feels seen and valued.
Absolutely.
And maybe, just maybe, that's the biggest takeaway from this deep dive into the life of Andrew David Edwards.
I think you're right.
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It is.
That someone could commit these brutal acts and then seek out these like almost mundane connections through pen pal websites.
Yeah, it's a real paradox. It really speaks to the fact that even with all the information we have,
Yeah.
there are still so many layers to this case, so many questions left unanswered.
And I think one of the most important things to remember is that
Yeah.
Edwards specifically preyed on people who were already struggling.
Absolutely.
People who were living, on the margins of society.
Exactly. His victims were transients, people who were often overlooked, underserved.
Right. And it raises some really tough questions about
Yeah.
how we as a society treat
Right.
the most vulnerable among us?
Big questions.
Do we do enough to provide support? Do we offer enough resources?
Yeah.
Or do we just turn a blind eye to the problems that lead to homelessness and addiction?
Those are big questions.
Yeah.
And they're not easy to answer.
No.
But they're questions we have to ask if we want to create a more just and compassionate world.
Yeah.
A world where people like Andrew David Edwards' victims don't fall through the cracks.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive into the life and crimes of Andrew David Edwards, what are your takeaways? What details stuck with you? What emotions did this story evoke?
It's heavy stuff.
It is.
But I think, for me,
Yeah.
the big takeaway is just a reminder that
Yeah.
understanding the complexities of human behavior is a lifelong process.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer to why someone becomes a serial killer.
No.
It's a combination of factors, individual choices, societal influences.
Yeah.
And while we may never fully understand what drove Edwards to commit these horrific acts,
Right.
we can use this knowledge to try and prevent similar tragedies in the future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the chilling details of the crimes
Oh, yeah.
to the broader questions about society and human nature.
It's a lot.
It is, but we hope this is giving you a new perspective on this case.
Yeah,
And maybe even spark some conversations of your own.
absolutely.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Always.
The more we understand about the darkness that exists in the world, the better equipped we are to fight against it.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been real.
Keep exploring,
Yeah,
keep questioning,
absolutely.
and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Can't let those go dull.
Until next time.
See ya.